Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first coronavirus webinar of 2021. Happy New Year. So this, like I said, is our first one of 2021. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by Mary Potorti, who's going to be talking about food system breakdowns in the COVID-19 pandemic. She's the assistant professor of political science, politics and social science at MCPHS. Just so everybody knows, the webinar, like all the other ones, will be recorded. I know, unfortunately, we can't always find a time that works for everybody, so that will be posted on the webinar website with all the other ones from the past. So it's nice to go back and look at these. I think this is the sixth one that we've done. We did 3 over the summer and 2 over the fall semester. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We're most likely going to save most of them until the end of the session. But if there's anything pressing, Mary has given me permission to interrupt her. But otherwise, I think I'll turn it over and let her take over. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Devin, and thank you all for being here. It's kind of hard to believe, I think, when this webinar started that we would have them into the spring of the following year, but here we are. At least the issues that I'm talking about have changed significantly over the past 10 months. They've sort of ebbed and flowed. But I think from top to bottom, the food system has really been, for those of us who have been fortunate enough to be safe at home, one of the ways that we have seen our lives directly affected by some of the larger systemic things that are happening because of COVID-19. So again, thank you all for being here. I want to start with sort of a more formal introduction, and then I'll talk through the rest of my slides. But as I was sort of thinking about, I guess this is the third iteration of my politics of food course since the coronavirus has really changed our lives so significantly. My syllabus has changed each semester as a result of that. And I think it's because, I know it's because so much of the inequalities we see in society are reflected in the food system itself. And so I suspect, like many of us over the past 10 months, I've been struck by how fundamentally the topics of my courses, but particularly the politics of food, has been affected by the onset and development of the pandemic. Almost from the top to the bottom of my syllabus, from topics ranging from food production and consumption to the viability of the industrial food system, questions about public health, obesity, and nutrition, and most of the point of what I'm going to talk about today, issues of first food labor, but also food insecurity and hunger have been exacerbated and really sort of telescoped and also microscoped some of the ways that the food system that we currently have is both inherently fragile and also inherently unjust, is the argument that I will make here. And so I want to take a systems approach to thinking about the food system. And by that, and I think this is probably not surprising to most of us, I want to acknowledge the ways that food as a commodity moves along a chain from the point of production to the point of consumption. And there are many different stops along the way where value is added, where labor and cost are extracted. And in doing that, thinking about food as a system or food systems, the US food system being dominated by the industrial system, I want to also acknowledge the ways that federal food policies are inherently linked, both to the system that we have and to each other. So federal food policies that determine what foods are grown, how much they cost, the welfare of those who produce or pick our food, and who can afford to eat what and under what conditions are inherently political questions that have been upended by the arrival of COVID-19, like so many other facets of our society. So that as the pandemic has revealed, both locally and globally, a weak or broken link or a dysfunctional policy upsets the functionality of the whole system. I also want to acknowledge that different segments of society have very different stakes in these systems, with some, as we've seen in the past 10 months, having literally billions of dollars to gain, and many more having their lives, health, or livelihoods on the line. My comments today, like my research, will focus on the US, but I also want to acknowledge that the disruptions we're experiencing here, particularly in the realm of hunger and food insecurity, are magnified in many parts of the world, with experts predicting famine-like conditions in the next decade as a result of these economic dislocations and devastation in developing parts of the world. So as is often true when we talk about hunger and food insecurity, what we think of as hunger in developing parts of the world is not what we're seeing here, but we're seeing a different form of hunger and a far more pervasive form of hunger than we have in recent decades. So in addition to this sort of systems approach to food and food production, I want to also bring and apply the lens of food justice, which is a theory and a sort of ideology that recognizes that to promote a just food system where food is equitably produced, fairly produced, sustainably produced, that system must also promote racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, gender justice, land justice. The system itself must be just if the food system and the food that is produced is to be produced for just ends. And so this sort of school of thinking acknowledges how food has been used by those who have control over the food system as a tool of power and as a force of oppression for those who work for that system, help produce the food, and to the point today, those who don't have equal access to the produce of that system. Those who are either hungry, which is the term the USDA used until about 15 years ago to quantify the segment of society that didn't have regular access to food, a term that today it refers to as those with low food security or very low food security. So using these two sort of frameworks, a systems approach and a food justice approach, I want to think about 5 realms of the food system that have really been disrupted because of the pandemic. And then again, I'll spend a good amount of time focusing specifically on the question of food insecurity. So first, one of the things I think as consumers we noticed was the fragility of the commodity chains. And again, by food commodity chain, we mean the sort of path that a product goes from its point of production, whether that be a farm or a dairy or a factory farm where most of our industrially produced meat is raised, to the endpoint, whether that be a restaurant or a grocery store, most likely, or some other institution. And so in early March, or actually late March, early April, the sort of food disruptions we saw were most likely to look like this, where there were shortages on the shelves. People were panic buying or hoarding products that they were worried wouldn't be in stock again soon, or because they didn't want to go back to a grocery store anytime soon, foods that were shelf stable like beans, frozen vegetables, and meats. We saw disruptions where at the same time that stories broke of farmers euthanizing dozens or hundreds of their livestock because they couldn't sell them or they didn't have a market for them, we see images like this where the meat shelves in a grocery store are pretty barren relative to what American consumers expect. And the reason this happened was because our food system is bifurcated, where about half of what we produce is packaged for grocery stores for household consumption, and obviously in smaller portions. And about half of it is geared towards sale in industrial setting or institutional settings, sorry. So things like restaurants, prisons, and schools. And when restaurants and schools shut down, the market for those foods that were produced for the institutional setting basically disappeared overnight. And so farmers who were growing or raising eggs for sale at restaurants and might sell batches and gallons of liquid eggs couldn't just quickly pivot and sell them in a grocery store. They didn't have the cartoning to do that. They didn't have the contracts or the contacts to do that. And so we saw vast amounts of food waste happening, where this not only happened particularly with farmers dumping milk, but also plowing under fields and fields of things like potatoes or onions, foods that people, we might not think about this, typically eat in a restaurant. They don't often buy for household consumption in the same way that they would eat in a restaurant. Things like purple cabbage, for example. And we also know that individuals, we might know this from personal experience, are going to buy different things at restaurants than they're going to buy to make in their own home. So things like more expensive cuts of meat like steak, the market for them dropped a little bit because people are less likely to buy them even when they were able to be packaged for consumption at home. So we saw the sort of illogic of a food system that was producing so much food that was actually going to waste at the same time that there were shortages. And since then, a lot of these sort of kinks have been ironed out. And certainly restaurants have opened up to some degree. A lot of restaurants have pivoted to doing takeout and have resumed the need for larger size orders in that fashion. But we saw in that 2-week to 2-month period a really sort of shocking incongruity. So much food that it was being literally wasted. It was literally costing farmers more to harvest it than they would actually make to sell it, at the same time that people were worried and really realizing for the first time for many of us, myself included, how reliant we are on somebody else to feed us, right? We saw some experimentation this summer, lots of little stories about people growing their own gardens for the first time, or patronizing CSAs, community supported agriculture, for the first time, or doing so in larger scale, realizing that it's far safer to count on somebody close to home to get your food than to count on getting your meat, for example, from a factory farm in Iowa, for example. Second, we see and continue to see high rates of job loss in some sectors of the food service economy, particularly due to the continued closure or limited capacity of bars and restaurants. So when we think about food labor, we certainly need to think about food servers as a huge part of that. And so at the same time that we see significant job losses, we see a decline of the food service economy, we see a rise of people from the food service economy becoming food insecure. Third, we see high rates of exposure, illness, and death among workers in particular segments of the food production economy, namely meatpacking workers and agricultural workers, so migrant farm workers. Meatpacking, and in both of these realms of the food production economy, workers are disproportionately likely to be people of color, people of lower education, people who are undocumented. So workers who are already economically and socially marginalized, already working in industries with high rates of sickness and injury. Meatpacking is considered by OSHA to be the most dangerous occupation in the country due to the fact that the simple line of production moves so quickly, with sometimes a chicken going by more than once a minute, and workers supposed to use a sharp knife in close proximity to someone else and do their specific task. So people frequently get cut, get injured by machinery and so on. So an occupation that's already dangerous was then considered essential, was open at the same or higher capacity. And meatpacking was the industry that the previous administration used the wartime production measures to keep open, rather than expedite production of PPE or testing supplies. Kept open the meatpacking industry under the wartime protection measures, saying that it was almost a national security issue that Americans got enough meat to eat. And so what this meant for meatpacking workers was that even in outbreaks in facilities, management, with the endorsement of the administration, tried to keep those facilities open, and sort of illustrate not only the dangers inherent in that kind of work, but particularly when we're in a setting with communicable disease, the dehumanization that happens frequently in that field of work is amplified in these kinds of conditions. And so in December, the story by NPR covered the firing by Tyson of 7 plant managers who were actually betting on the number of their workers who would contract COVID. And so we have here a clear illustration, not only of the sort of dehumanization of workers that's happening, but that the managers have a vested interest, not simply in winning this wager, but in also keeping workers moving to get their products to the market. And I think that really is the most sort of flagrant disregard we see, or at least the sort of most dramatized. And Tyson, for, I guess to its credit, fired the plant managers after it was confirmed that this happened. But that was not immediate measure. And even as recently as 2 weeks ago, stories were coming out of workers not being given clean masks, for example, and so continuing an 8 to 12 hour shift in masks that had animal blood on them, which of course are going to be less effective if they're wet. So we see this sort of disregard for the health and safety of workers that is exacerbated and amplified by the social identity of who workers in these industries are. Then we see soaring rates of low food security and very low food security, which are the official terms, again, that the Department of Agriculture uses to assess what it had previously called hunger in the United States. And these rates are higher, not surprisingly, among families with children. That's typically the case, as are rates of poverty typically higher among families with children. And sort of as a snapshot, food insecurity rates in general have doubled since last March, and they have tripled for families with children. A large factor in that is the closure of schools, which have been a huge source of food security or increased food security for children who are from low-income families eligible for school food. And then finally, there's this underlying reality that's come out, I think, that's been revealed about how food injustice and food apartheid are really sort of underlying conditions that are central to the populations that are most likely affected by COVID-19. So groups that are already at risk of severe illness or death due to COVID-19, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately people who are in poor health with underlying conditions, often related to diet. So obesity, hypertension, high blood pressure, obesity, heart disease, and hypertension are among those who are already underserved or exploited by the industrial food system and often work for that industrial food system. So disproportionately poor communities and communities of color. Okay, so I want to spend, and I'm happy to talk about any of those issues towards the end, but I want to spend a good amount of the remaining time talking about food insecurity, and particularly how and why it's gotten worse in the past 10 months, and the sort of uneven measures that the government has taken to address food insecurity. So the USDA, which is the federal agency that is both responsible for encouraging American consumers to buy the produce of American farmers and is responsible for feeding hungry Americans. It's tasked with both of those things and encouraging, informing Americans what is considered healthy, which is kind of a conflict of interest there, defines food insecurity or food insecure households as those that do not have access at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life for all household members. So there's a couple of sort of qualifying features in there that make food insecurity kind of an elastic term. Because, for example, a household can be considered food insecure while all of the children have enough to eat, but the parent does not, because the parent is sacrificing some of their meal or some of the quality of their food so that the children have enough to eat. That would still be considered a food insecure household. For a different definition, the College and University Food Bank Alliance, which studies a group closer to home for most of us, college and university students, defines food insecurity as the limited or uncertain availability of nutritionally adequate foods, or the ability to acquire such foods in a socially acceptable manner. And I think that last part is important because that would then include people who might get enough to eat, but do so by shoplifting or dumpster diving, or in some social settings, going to ask their neighbors, right? So part of the definition, it also includes the manner under which someone has to secure that food. And advocates of food justice, particularly anti-hunger workers, really try to emphasize the importance of promoting human dignity in the process of generating and promoting food security. That it's not just enough to ensure that everyone has enough to eat, which is something that we're not doing, right? But food justice also requires that people are treated as humans as they're seeking to fill this basic human need, so that someone isn't ashamed. For example, a child who is receiving a school lunch isn't singled out for their need if they're receiving a free lunch. In some school districts, for example, students who have school debt are, very sort of publicly not permitted to get food if they haven't paid off their bill. And those sorts of ways of sort of dramatizing need and sort of stigmatizing need are really targeted by advocates of food justice who see food insecurity as innately related to questions of human dignity. So where are we right now? As of last week, the Washington Post estimated 50 million Americans, including 17 million children, are currently food insecure. Of those, 38 million receive food stamps. So that statistic, that's a lot of Americans on food stamps, but that's 12 million Americans who are defined as food insecure who are not receiving federal assistance through food stamps, which is a huge number. For a point of reference, through the whole year of 2019, at any point, 35 million Americans were considered food insecure. So that's taking into account that someone, head of a household might lose their job in March. The family might be food insecure for a couple of months, but then sort of get back on their feet and then no longer be considered food insecure. 35 million at any point in 2019, and currently 50 million as of January. I think that number, January 22nd, so last week. So we're talking about a significant number. So why is food insecurity on the rise? I think some of these answers are very obvious, right? With rising rates of economic insecurity and joblessness and dislocation, rising rates of poverty, food insecurity is going to rise. Even as families might be able to use, for example, enhanced unemployment benefits to pay their rent. Food costs are seen by most sort of household heads as more flexible, certainly more flexible than rent, mortgage payments, car payments, utilities. And even though we're currently in a period of an eviction moratorium, we don't have rent forgiveness yet, right? So there's this idea that you have to keep up with things that are less flexible than your food bill. So what that means is that families might substitute a higher quality or higher nutrition, meal of higher nutritional value for something that's processed that is going to be less healthy. They might eat 2 meals a day instead of 3. They might eat less at each meal, for example, or as is often the case in parents with or households with children, the children might notice a change in the quality of their food or the type of their food, but not the amount, while the parent might significantly reduce their intake to make up for the difference in the bill. And this is known as the heat or eat dilemma, right? Do you want to spend the money to keep your diet the same as it was when you were maybe doing better off financially, or do you want to keep the heat on? And in January in New England, for example, the heat is not something we're really able to compromise on, right? And so there's also the flexibility or the sort of psychological fallback of knowing or hoping that there's community resources available as well, right? To go to the Greater Boston Food Bank or to go to a local church or food pantry and get some help. So food costs are one of the first things that people cut. Second is the insufficiency of federal food aid programs, particularly the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which used to be called food stamps and for some reason is still called food stamps by many people. And I argue it's insufficient both in who is eligible for it and in terms of the benefit it actually provides. And we'll get into that in a minute. Third, as I mentioned before, is the disruption of school food programs. School closures have obviously affected low-income students who rely on school food for 10 meals a week for many of them. And despite the sort of bad reputation that school food gets in terms of its quality, recent studies have shown, particularly since the Obama administration set in new guidelines that have been, I will say, watered down in the last couple of years, but are still better than what they were before. A lot of low-income children get most of their nutrition from school, most of their quality food from school. Studies have shown that the months students spend over the summer, they're more likely to gain weight across socioeconomic classes because they're less active, because they're more likely to sort of snack during the day. And so this sort of 10-month summer, in the sense of that sort of living, the sort of eating patterns, are really raising alarms about looming higher rates of childhood obesity. At the same time, we've got higher rates of food insecurity and hunger. And we want to emphasize that hunger and food insecurity are not strangers, they're neighbors, right? They live in the same, not just the same communities, but often the same households. And the child who might physically be experiencing physiological hunger and socially experiencing food insecurity can also be clinically overweight or obese. And then finally, we see surging demand on charitable food programs at the same time that donations have declined. So because the need is more widespread, individuals are giving a little bit less. And because the food system, the commodity chain has been disrupted, grocery stores have less overstock to donate to food banks and food pantries. At the same time that volunteers are declining because people who volunteer in general, but particularly at places like food banks, tend to be older retired, and therefore more likely to be vulnerable to the worst effects of COVID. But I do want to emphasize too, that even if food charitable programs were meeting the need, that relying on charity is not a form of security. That's not a secure plan, right? You can't count on the goodwill of people for the survival and health of other people. That's not a plan. That's sort of a hope, right? So food insecurity sort of telescoped, right? This is a map of the US, obviously, and I think the date is November, but the way my system is the date November? It's covered by your faces at the bottom. We see here the higher rates of food insecurity are the states that are sort of a dark purple. So Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Arizona, South Carolina. Mississippi, for what it's worth, has for the past several years been among the poorest states in the country, among the most food insecure, among the most obese, and among the highest population of Black Americans. And so all of those things, all of those features of food insecurity and food injustice coexist in Mississippi, which I think pretty tellingly is an agricultural state, right, where it produces from the land. And so if we look up to New England, we're doing pretty good until you notice that the lightest blue is 6% food insecurity. So the lowest amount shown is 6%. If you look telescoped into Boston, Boston's still looking pretty good. But what we see if we actually look about change over the last year is that Massachusetts has had the highest percentage increase in food insecurity overall by 59%, and particularly among children by 102%, which is huge. And if we telescope into Norfolk County, where Weymouth, for example, is, we see a surge in percent increase in food insecurity, particularly among children, 163% over the past year. And so what that suggests is that hunger and food insecurity is growing across the country, but particularly in places that have not recently had to deal with high rates of food insecurity. Which means, recent news stories have covered, mothers coming for the first time with their children to food banks in Weymouth, and really sort of not knowing how to navigate the system, not knowing, for example, if they're eligible for SNAP, or not being comfortable applying for a public benefit with the stigma that sometimes holds. And so the problems that exist in a place like Massachusetts, specifically Norfolk County, in dealing with higher rates of food insecurity are going to be different, not, I wouldn't say better or worse, but very different than someplace like Mississippi, which has chronic food insecurity that has gotten worse, right? So people are used to being food insecure, but Mississippi is also poor and has fewer resources to deal with that. So all I'm trying to do here is point out that the obstacles that a place like Boston is facing is going to be very different than the obstacles in a place like Jackson, Mississippi, for example. What does this look like by race? Again, I think not surprisingly, rates are far higher for Black Americans, Latinx Americans, and far lower for white Americans and Asian Americans. The two bars here, the blue bar is rates of households reporting sometimes or often not having enough to eat in 2018 versus the green bar in July of last year. And again, not surprisingly, if we look to respondents specifically with children, the rates are even higher. So this emphasizes again, right, that this is not a problem that's affecting all Americans equally, that disproportionately communities of color are struggling. And not surprisingly, I think just particularly Black Americans and Latinx Americans are also more likely to be affected by joblessness stemming from the food industry and the service industry more broadly. Closer to home, what does this look like in terms of college students, where most of us sort of make our daily sort of community, or at least our physical community, prior to shutdowns last year. This data is from 2019, right? So at two-year institutions, rates of food insecurity are, I think, shockingly high, 42 to 55%, depending on whether or not people who report marginal food security, meaning they usually get enough to eat, but there's a lot of anxiety around whether they're going to be able to do that. Rates are a little bit lower at four-year institutions, 33 to 48%, again, whether or not that marginal food security category is counted. But those are still very high. And those rates are higher among students of color and among international students in particular. And so if this is 2019, it's incredibly safe to say the rates are worse, right? Because students are maybe have suffered job loss themselves. Their parents might have suffered job loss. Students are no longer, in many cases, living on campus or coming to campus where they might be able to access the resources of a campus food pantry. And so when we think about what resources our students might need, sometimes that might be introducing them to the idea that they're eligible for SNAP benefits, as insufficient as those might be, because students who aren't coming to campus are cut off from the possibility of obtaining tangible benefits from food pantries, not just at our campus, of course, but throughout the country. So the federal response, and I want to bring this back to the idea of the systems approach and how central the federal government is to the food system that we have, not just in the sense that it's the forum for channeling taxpayer dollars that signify what our country prioritizes, but because the federal government is such a huge investor in specific types of foods that are grown, particularly commodity crops like soy and corn, which, as we know, are used to make, by and large, processed foods, which by and large are unhealthy, and which by and large are less expensive than fresh foods that are more nutritious. So from February to December of last year, which was the last data I was able to find, there's been a 15% increase in SNAP enrollment. So 15% increase in people who are receiving food stamp benefits through an EBT card each month. Prior to the CARES Act, which was signed towards the end of March, which was significant in providing stimulus checks, and perhaps even more significantly in providing enhanced federal unemployment benefits through the end of July. About 2 weeks before that, the federal government passed the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which dealt with things like sick leave in particular, but also addressed food security in two ways. The first was the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, CFAP, which channeled $19 billion into the food industry. About $16 billion of that was to recoup losses, economic losses. The last $3 billion was to bring food that would otherwise go to waste to people who needed it. So whether that meant individual sort of farmers to families boxes, where families could come either to a church or to sort of a farmer's market type setting and pick up a box of commodities, or to food banks through what has been called the farmers to food bank sort of chain, commodity chain. And the idea was to take food that would otherwise go to waste and get it to people who needed it, which has been the sort of central principle, the central approach of addressing hunger in this country, right? Take food that would otherwise be thrown out and give it to hungry people, often regardless of what that food actually is. The quality of that food, whether or not it's culturally appropriate for the community that it's being offered to. And this program, again, $3 billion is not nothing, targeting to get food to hungry people. The sort of on the ground way that this played out was at first pretty well received. In places like Mississippi, for example, there were a lot of stories of Black farmers who really sort of took up this mantle to bring their food to community members who needed it. By and large, there were very few hiccups. But when it came time to renew the contracts with these farmers, determine who would continue to get this money, small farmers were left out. And big corporations, food corporations like Cisco, won business when they didn't really need the business to stay afloat. Other corporations won business because they had good infrastructure for delivering things, but not food. They weren't food companies necessarily. And so, and another sort of act of politicization, in October, these boxes were sort of eyed by the administration prior to the election, when the president put letters in both English and Spanish, sort of touting how the administration was trying to feed hungry people. again, using federal tax dollars. And so there's sort of a stigma around how these food assistance program and its process was carried out. It was refunded with an extra $1 billion, but again, there's questions about who's actually benefiting from this infusion of cash into the food system. And then second, and a big benefit for low-income families was in recognition that so many students from low-income families were losing out on the benefit of school meals. The value of that benefit, which was set at $5.70 a day, has been put on the EBT card. So students whose families are already receiving SNAP benefits, an extra $28 a week per student is added to that to cover the cost of those meals. And for students whose families might not get SNAP, but who are eligible for free lunch, whether that was through a community verification, so the whole community, the whole school student body received free meals because it was a low-income neighborhood, those families would receive $28 per week after a school was closed for 5 or more consecutive days. And that has been sort of seen as an effective measure. Certainly an extra $28 is helpful when you're trying to make ends meet. A big criticism of the emergency response is that although more states were authorized to give more families the maximum benefit didn't go up. So people who were already receiving the maximum benefit, because by definition they were the poorest of the poor, didn't get any extra help. And if we look here, when we think about what the benefit actually is, it's hard to live on. The tier for qualification or eligibility, for a family of 4, the gross income per year cannot exceed $34,000. So if you make $35,000 as a family of 4, you're not eligible for food stamps. And if you make $33,000 a year, you're eligible. But the government also expects you to take up 30% of the cost of your monthly expenses. So if the maximum benefit for a family of 4 with no income is $680, if you make $33,000, they take 30% of your monthly income and subtract it from the monthly benefit, the maximum benefit, which is why we see an average benefit for a family of 4 of $477. And so I would argue first that these eligibility ceilings are too low, especially when we're trying to keep people in their homes, right? And acknowledging the fact that eligibility is restricted to people with fewer than $3,000 in checking or savings. So you have to deplete your checking or savings to $3,000 before you're eligible for this. So if we're talking about, only serving the most desperate of the desperate, we're still not giving them a lot. But if we're talking about trying to keep people out of poverty, these numbers just don't add up. Which is why, according to the USDA's own statistics, millions of people who receive food stamps are still considered food insecure. Good news, last Friday, President Biden signed an executive order that was aiming to address at least the issue of the very poor and the benefit cap for SNAP for them, asking the USDA to permit states to increase the SNAP benefits maximum, and also increasing by 15% the PEBT benefit to families of children who qualify for school food assistance, which will come out to, and the math is kind of weird, for a family of 3, an increase of $100 over 2 months. So not huge, but something. And it's also, I think, encouraging that the new vice president has a strong track record on issues of food justice. She stood behind food labor, stood behind higher wages and measures that strengthen the hunger safety net. And the new second spouse, Doug Emhoff, is considering taking on food insecurity as his sort of issue as second gentleman. And so that's not going to bring overnight change, but it is sort of comforting, I think, to see people who recognize the severity of the issues that the country is facing in terms of food insecurity, empower at least in some capacity. So how's my time? Okay. We'll open up for Q&A in just a minute, but I have a couple of sort of takeaway points, I think. How can we advance food justice in light of these realities? Because it is, I think I've painted a bleak picture here, but I don't want to, I think it's not productive to leave thinking that there's no hope. First, we need to invest in local food systems. And I don't just mean as consumers, I mean as a government, and divest from big agriculture. So these big corporations. One thing to note about SNAP, for example, is that as lockdowns are in place, as people are discouraged from going to the grocery store, particularly if they have, if they're at high risk, for most parts of the country, initially, they were not able to use SNAP benefits to buy online groceries. That has changed to about 47 states now, where they can, where people with SNAP benefits can use them at Amazon, Walmart, and Aldi. So that money that is coming from taxpayers is going back to these huge companies, right? Another issue related to that is the cost that many on SNAP say that the $15 or so delivery and tip is not actually worth, or is not economically viable way for them to do their grocery shopping. But the long and short of it is that the government needs to make it possible for people to invest and for it to be viable to patronize local food systems. And increasingly that's possible through the use of EBT benefits at things like farmers markets. But in a larger scale, they need to make local food more viable by actually putting money behind it. Second, we need to sort of work to dismantle what scholar Andy Fisher calls the hunger industrial complex that encourages big corporations like Walmart or McDonald's to pay low wages and then get tax breaks for donating goods or money to subsidize their own labor force. So we see this headline from November: Walmart and McDonald's, these huge corporations, multi-billion dollars, have the most workers on food stamps and Medicaid, meaning they're paying low wages, and then the US taxpayer is essentially subsidizing their labor force through these public programs. We need to dismantle that, and again, funnel money to these smaller producers. Third, I think essentially, we just need to raise wages because hunger is a poverty issue. We've been talking about paying essential workers, or we've been talking about how essential grocery store workers are, delivery workers are. And for many of them, not many, but some received hazard pay for a couple months, but that's come and gone. And we need to treat essential workers like they're essential. In 2013, fast food workers were the first organized entity to really start a national movement for $15 minimum wage. The president and many politicians are sort of getting behind that. And it's, I think, worth noting that what was $15 in 2013 is now $16.75. So we're already behind and we don't have a $15 minimum wage. So raising wages, particularly for these big corporations that can not only afford it, but that are, again, outsourcing the cost of their labor to taxpayers. This is an essential step. We need to increase SNAP benefits, and we need to lower the threshold for eligibility, I think. And for fiscal conservatives, it's worth noting that SNAP is economic stimulus, that for every $1 that the US government issues in SNAP benefits, an estimated $1.50 to $1.80 in economic benefits through job creation is generated. And that's by the USDA's estimate. We need to expand where SNAP benefits can be used online, and also I would argue to include hot meals, because families that are working hard to keep their family together to make ends meet are expected to prepare meals from scratch, and that's not always possible. So things like a hot rotisserie chicken, you should be able to buy that, I would say, with your SNAP benefits. And then finally, these last two are pretty big issues, and I'm not sure exactly which angle to target them from, but we have to acknowledge that systemic racism is at play in all of these injustices that we're talking about. Issues of food access, food insecurity, and obesity disproportionately affect communities of color. We need to look at how food deserts operate. Food deserts are communities, geographic communities, where access to things like a grocery store are impossible or very difficult. And that's measured by typically by miles to the closest grocery store. And we need to look at food swamps, which conversely are typically low-income areas that are saturated with things like fast food outlets, convenience stores, and liquor stores, where the fare for sale is largely processed. And then finally, I think we need to dismantle policy silos that have hunger and food insecurity handled by the Department of Agriculture rather than under Health and Human Services. We need to acknowledge that hunger is related to questions of joblessness and housing, and that you can't just sort of throw, commodities at people who are physically hungry and expect the problem of hunger to go away. Those are Band-Aid solutions that sort of keep people fed, but they're no less food insecure than they might have been otherwise. Yeah, okay, I think that's it. Sorry, there's a couple of minutes left if anyone's up for some discussion, but thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was such a great presentation. I think it's great to see, connecting these issues to the current pandemic, but it's also a really good opportunity just to learn about these issues of food insecurity, as as you emphasize throughout that. That's not like it's a new thing, right? It's something that we struggle for.
New faces.
So yeah, very interesting. So yeah, we can turn it over to questions if anybody has any. Feel free to write. Oh, we got one already. So Unadi asks, is food insecurity more common among specific age groups of children? And she also says, also would creating more awareness, education, more prevention programs and policies through public resources and in schools contribute to reduction in food insecurity? Sorry, food insecurity, I think is what you meant.
So food insecurity among children being more common, it's less common among children ages 0 to 5 because there are specific WIC, for example, women, infants, and children, target specifically women with children 5 and under with things like formula and specific supplemental food items. I would say I don't have statistics for age in general, but it's at different times of year, it's worse, right? So it's worse during the summer. Because even though students who are eligible for those 10 meals a week with free breakfast or reduced price breakfast and lunch don't typically get them, even if there are measures in place to go pick up lunch at school, for example. As children get older, as they sort of come towards adulthood, I would suspect that they would fall sort of under the behaviors of their parents that might be eating less to allow their younger siblings to eat more, but that's my suspicion only. But the federal government, in part because malnutrition and hunger are so devastating in the very early years of childhood for development, for cognitive function, has targeted specifically up to age 5. But is there a huge difference between a child who's 5 and a child who's 6? Which sort of raises the question: how do we sort of determine where the cutoff is? Would creating more awareness and education.
What I was interpreting that was, I know that for a lot of social programs, sometimes it's the people that are most in need of them who are the least aware.
I see.
Do you ever see that with food programs as well?
I see. So I guess if we look at this as a question of people not knowing the resources are out there for them, if that's thinking about public awareness that way, I definitely came across that. I have come across that in terms of college students, for example, who might be eligible for SNAP, but don't realize it either because they conceptualize themselves as being a child in their parents' household, but might actually on their own be eligible for SNAP, or for people who are newly food insecure, who haven't worked through the social system or social services system, who might not have that awareness. But then there's also a huge barrier that it's difficult to be certified for these under normal circumstances. A lot of those barriers have been taken down. But prior to the pandemic, for example, a face-to-face interview is required to get SNAP benefits. And not only is that not convenient, but particularly for people who are hesitant around, representatives of the government, that might be a process that intimidates them or keeps them away. And so whether it's about, I think, raising awareness that the programs exist or maybe lowering barriers to being certified in the first place. And also the stigma around the way we talk about food stamps and what can be purchased with things on food stamps. One thing I think that has historically plagued anti-hunger efforts is sort of the belief that people who don't need assistance should be able to tell people who do need assistance what they can eat, or what they, you know, what they should be able to buy with their money. And so that, I think, can also come down to, again, the question or the possibility of allowing people to use SNAP benefits to buy a prepared meal so that they come home and don't have to cook from scratch after working a job or two and have kids at home. And that the idea that if you're, quote, so poor, you're gonna do what you have to do, is dehumanizing in itself and stigmatizing in itself. And I think in my perception, almost, public attitudes about, or public awareness could be targeted to people who don't need the benefits in some ways, right? That there has to be some education about the pervasiveness of food insecurity. And I think because of the large scale of the problem in the past year, and the recognition that people who have never experienced this before are, or at least think that they might in the future, right? People who have jobs that might not be there next month, that it is sort of becoming less of a seen as sort of a niche issue, but it is I think being recognized as a broader problem.
One thing that I think you kind of hit on this early on, though. It seemed like in the early days of the pandemic, there was like a supply issue and then also a demand issue, right? Because we had all the stories about people hoarding. And
Mhm.
I don't know if you have any thoughts about which one was more contributing to shortages, or if it was just, the combination of both.
Well, I think it's circular, right? When you see that there are shortages of meat, when you see 3 packs, you might buy 3 packs, whereas you need 1 or 2 for the next week or so. And I think it also had to do with people trying to, at least initially, limit their trips to the grocery store.
Mhm. So,
But that only works for people who have freezer space, who have a lot of money to put out on groceries for 3 weeks. So there, were stories, and this is, a sort of different example of a mother going to buy diapers. And everyone had bought out the diapers, and she's like, I can't diaper my kid because you've got diapers for the next 4 months in your closet, because she couldn't put out the money in advance. And so I think part of it was the people who were most affected by the sort of hoarding and panic buying were the people who don't have the stockpile of money, people who are getting a monthly income of food on SNAP, for example, who can't just sort of buy it when it's there. If they go, to spend their money and it's not there, they don't get it, right? It's not sort of an issue of, but I think the shortages made people worry more about getting for the future, right? Because the shortages were exacerbated. I think there was probably enough for people for the next week or two, but because people were buying for the long term, it made things worse for sure. Thankfully, that I think is mitigated largely. Outbreaks in beef packing, for example, that have led to closures of these corporations that are in charge of, slaughtering and packaging sometimes 20-30% of the nation's beef supply, can lead to price increases and can lead to sort of questions about shortages. But those have been, I think, quickly sort of ironed over, because it's meat as opposed to, which is already in some ways seen. It's a common item, but it's less essential than like bread in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, and this kind of intersects with my research interest, which is occupational health, is how we see these overlapping vulnerabilities, like you talked about with the, in the food industry, like the meatpacking industry, where they're vulnerable with respect to being essential workers in particularly dangerous environments, but then also low wages contributing to the risk, and how these things all, pile up on top of each other, really.
Yeah.
We had one other question. Would there be any specific programs that you would suggest to reduce food insecurity among poor children? And I think I might want to also add to that, because you mentioned students being a group that might not be aware. Are there any resources that students at NCPHS should be aware of?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for poor children, I think before introducing new programs, I think we just need to make our current programs more robust, right? Our SNAP benefit right now comes out to $1.40 per meal per person on average. That is not, if anyone's managed a household budget or even your own budget, that's not doable. And so families who get SNAP and try to eat a normal diet can do so for about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks out of the month. And then they're, often either cutting back or relying or turning to charitable food sources. And that is not sustainable, it's not reliable, it's not secure. So I would say the benefit needs to be increased. I don't have a specific number, but I know $1.40 is not workable. As for college students, I think there are a couple of sort of demographics of college students, right? The college students who are living on campus who might be food insecure because they have, a 10-week or 10 meal a week meal plan that they don't want to ask their parents for more money. If that's how they lost their job because they're, part of the economy that's contracted, that might typically access the campus food pantry, which I think we need to make clearer exists, that there is a campus food pantry. And I think we need to make it clear for students in need and for students who are not in need, who might be willing to donate. And I think we need to invest in that more from an institutional standpoint. I'm not as familiar with the campus food pantry as I would like to be, honestly. But by and large, as with any kind of food pantry, it's based off of the sort of understanding that someone's going to donate, right? And so I think one thing for college students is to recognize that they might be eligible for these federal programs, insufficient though they might be, right? That they're out there, and that SNAP in particular, if you're eligible, is something. It's not nothing. It's not enough, but it's not nothing.
Great. Well, I just want to thank you again, Mary. This was such a great talk. I think such an important
Thanks,
element to
Devin.
understand all these, all the effects that the pandemic's having. It's not just purely the things that we jump first to mind.
For sure.
So again, the recordings of this will be posted hopefully within the next few weeks. So I'm actually going to paste a link into the chat. Some of you are asking, and you can find all the recordings there. And then for any future talks, they will also be posted there. So there are none scheduled right now, but I've sort of been scheduling them as they go. So if there are any faculty watching now or watching the recording and you're interested, please get in touch with me, because I think this has been such a great opportunity. I've learned so much from these. It's been really enjoyable. So
Great idea, Devin.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great rest of your week, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye, Devin.